This here is ASRock's B650E PG-ITX motherboard. I'll give you the rundown on the board features, we'll discuss the performance, and we'll see how it stacks up. Welcome to Machines and More. We've been going through Ryzen 7000 boards, and this is the final Ryzen 7000 mini-ITX board for the time being. We've gone through X670E, B650, and B650E ITX boards, and last week we reviewed the Asus B650E board. Very likely, folks will be cross-shopping these two boards, the ASRock and the Asus, since they're both B650E, and the price, it's closer between those two. Now, this ASRock board is the only other current ITX board featuring the B650E chipset. That extra E means PCIe Gen 5 expansion slot, PCIe Gen 5 M.2. For this board, the Gen 5 M.2 is the one on the top, and that's covered by what is arguably the most eye-catching and perhaps polarizing feature of this board. It's this M.2 heatsink that has a sloped cutaway at the top here. It is equipped with a fan. It's kind of a strange implementation, but we'll touch on that shortly. So let's take a look at what you got on this board. Starting at the top, 8-pin EPS connector at the top left, pretty standard. Not one, but two ARGB ports at the top of the board, which is great for customizing lighting effects. On your right, the first fan header is designated as CPU fan 1. That's a 1 amp header. Right next to that one, this is the one that's connected to the M.2 fan. It is CPU 2 or water pump. It's connected to the M.2 heatsink via this unsightly cable. It's kind of ugly. But the broader implication here is that by design, the M.2 fan occupies this header. And if you need this header for something else, you'll either have to unplug it and figure out what you want to do with this cable, or physically remove the fan. Otherwise, you'll just have this ugly cable dangling here, or you can split it out, which isn't great for RPM control if you're indexing off of CPU temp for that header and you have an AIO pump connected to that. If you run the M.2 fan, the speeds are going to be all over the place if you're following the CPU temp. So kind of a strange implementation here. One nice thing though is that the CPU fan 2, or the AIO pump header, this one is a 2 amp header, as is the chassis fan that's towards the bottom left here. That's also a 2 amp header. The CPU 1 fan header is a 1 amp header, but in general, 2 amp headers aren't very common on ITX boards, so that's generous in that respect. How's that useful? If you want to run, say, 4 case fans that can draw up to 0.3 or 0.4 amps, such as the Fantex T30s at max RPM, well, you can do that all in one header, and that's quite convenient. 2 RAM slots here, up to 64 gigabytes. Higher RAM speeds are compatible here. This is a 6000 megahertz kit. Got a 24-pin connector, 2 SATA ports, 2 SATA data ports, 1 USB 3.2. Right under that, you have a full set of front panel connections. Right next to that is the USB 2.0 connector, and at the bottom here is a USB 3.2 20 gigabits per second front panel USB-C connector. To the right, directly right under this latch, is the clear CMOS header. Kind of a strange spot for that, and you're gonna have to take off your card to get to this one for sure. So this M.2 heatsink is quite large, and it's sloped away at the top here, most likely for air cooler compatibility. I would say it's quite thin, but it is actually on the taller side in terms of the height. To access the M.2, you're just gonna back out these 2 screws, 1, 2, and then you'll notice a metal pipe connects the power delivery heatsink and the edge of the bottom part of the M.2 section. The M.2 slots right into here, you screw it down there. These 2 sections are connected via the heat pipe, but the M.2 fan is on the top part of the heatsink, so it's only going to cool the M.2 because this is the M.2 is the only thing it touches, so this isn't a VRM fan. If your M.2 temps aren't critical, keeping in mind there's a lot of metal here already for heat dissipation. When it is running at a higher RPM, this fan is very noticeable since it's a different sound quality versus your system fan. So if those M.2 temps aren't critical, I personally just remove the fan. To do that, you can unscrew 3 screws under the fan blades here, back this cable out of the groove, and then just unplug it, and then you can free up that fan header as well. My test build, I had CPU fans connected to the CPU header, case fans connected to the case fan header, and if this is plugged in, how am I going to connect the water pump? All right, so you could split it off of the CPU fan. You may not want to run them at the same percentage, probably not. So you have to unplug this to do that. So that's the inconvenient thing about it. So you're maybe not going to be able to use that anyway. Now, some ITX builds, you have no case fans, and you just have those AIO fans. That's fine. Then you can just use the bottom one as the AIO pump fan. That could work, but you know, kind of clunky. Directly to the left of this assembly is the other 2 amp header. This is the chassis fan header, which I seriously wonder if they were going to take up a fan header out of these 3, why didn't they just take this one and run a very short cable to this one instead of this long thing? Right next to that, 4 pins, it's an internal speaker header. Not very common these days. This board does not have a debug LED, so that can kind of do that function. It'll give you beeps if you have an issue with your CPU or RAM or whatever. But that's not very common these days. You'll have to go get an internal speaker. But yeah, that's what it's for. You have your audio codec here. It's Realtek ALC1220 and the HD audio connector right next to it. One thing I noticed was with the chassis fan and the front panel audio cable connected, there's no elegant location to route those 2 cables. And there's, you know, the flat bottom of the M.2 heatsink, it's going to be right up against your GPU. And the top, you know, it's kind of the only place it can go. These grooves are too small for the front panel audio cable, so you can't tuck it in. Depending on the fan cable, you might get it to slot into the heatsink grooves. It would have been better if there's just a cutout on the bottom of the heatsink. Over to the back, second M.2 slot, good location for that. Yeah, this is a Gen 4 one. The Gen 5 is only on the top. This is an interesting connector. It's for connecting ASRock's side panel display kit. So it's like a secondary display you can put on the side of your case. You can integrate that display into a suitable build if you have such a case that can display it, such as the inside of the NR200P's glass panel. And that can be used as your secondary display for, you know, if you want to watch videos. And I don't know how, you know, ergonomic that would be, but mainly it's going to be for displaying system vitals. So, in fact, not too many ASRock boards support this connector, and this is one of those boards. So overall layout, it's okay, right? No add-on cards or external audio dongles required, but it's not as good as the Asus B650E ITX, and the MSI B650E ITX is slightly better just because of ASRock's odd choices here with the M.2 fan cable and the designated header there. No debug LED or clear CMOS button here. You got a CMOS header and a clear CMOS header in a very strange location. Moving on to the rear I/O. This one is a little bit slim. It's a little bit on the weaker side for USB. So you have 3 3.2 Type A Gen 2 ports, and that's it, just 3. They do give you 4 Type A 2.0 ports, but I'd rather have a few more high-speed ports. It may not matter for many users, but I would just prefer to have the high-speed options just in case you need it. There's also no BIOS flashback function with any of these 2.0 ports. I definitely prefer that option for updating BIOS, but you can still update your BIOS within the BIOS. Usually that's a little bit riskier, but it's not the end of the world, right? Outside of that, you have a single Type-C port. This one tops out at 10 gigabits per second, and that is slower than the front panel one, which is a 20 gigabits per second port. I'd rather have it the other way around, since there's a zero guarantee that your SFF case has a Type-C connector, right? Depending on the build that you are doing. Not everyone has that. And as a reference point, the MSI has a 20 gig port on the back and the front panel USB-C connector. Other connectors here, it does have an optical audio port, which is nice. You got a mic input and line out. Audio codec here is Realtek's ALC1220. It's not too bad, pretty comparable to the 4080. still onboard audio complete here on the board without needing any external options. And you do have Wi-Fi 6E and a 2.5G Ethernet port. Overall, it's not bad, but the lack of high-speed USB-A options makes this one of the weaker Ryzen 7000 ITX contenders. The power delivery with this board is very good. It's a 10+2+1 setup with the 2 for the SoC and 1 miscellaneous stage, but for the CPU, it's 10 105 amp stages, so it's a lot more robust than Asus's B650E ITX, which is 10 70 amp stages. In fact, it's just slightly trailing the Asus X670E ITX, which is 10 110 amp stages for the V-Core. So in that front, this board is very, very well spec'd. Build quality, it's not terrible. This is supposed to be a 10-layer PCB. The entire board still feels a little bit more on the budget side. It's mostly comparable to the Asus B650E ITX. You do have the integrated rear I/O shield, which all Ryzen 7000 ITX boards have at this point. Some of the headers were a little bit crooked, such as the some of the connectors on the front panel section here. So mostly it's okay. For sure it's not great though, but I'd say it's definitely comparable in terms of build quality to the Asus B650E that we just checked out. Did a test build in the NR200P test case. Same case that I've been using these to test all the boards. Startup time, the first time was a little bit long, and it felt even longer because there wasn't a debug light to tell me that the memory training was happening. So more than a few minutes here. It did eventually start up, but the debug light I feel is quite vital for Ryzen 7000 boards, only to let you know that the memory controller is at work. So I did test with a 6000 megahertz kit, no problems with that kit. Speeds like that, even though spec'd on your RAM kit, are technically an OC for Ryzen 7000, so there's no guarantee it's going to work. After the initial training, subsequent boots took about 19 seconds from the power button being pressed to get to the initialization screen. So it's a little bit slower than the Asus. I've always found that ASRock's BIOS has an awkward UI, and this one is no exception. It just feels very clunky and awkward. For example, if you want to adjust your fan curves, most of the other major board manufacturers have a shortcut to get into fan curves, F6. Instead, with this board, you need to go into the hardware monitoring, and then you need to scroll through the fan settings, and you're like, oh shoot, there's no fan curves on this board. You have to manually key in each control point. This sucks, right? But then you click on Fantastic, which, folks, these colors really hurt my eyes. But there are fan curves, and within fan settings, you can also toggle this CPU 2 fan header between M.2 function or water pump. When you want more granular control of the header though, for the water pump mode, it defaults to motherboard temps as a reference temp, which is typically not what you want. You want the CPU temp for that. But then you jump into the M.2 mode, there is no option to use an M.2 temp as a reference point, just a motherboard temp. So, you know, there's little things like that. I'm still not a big fan of ASRock's BIOS in general, but it's not like you're in BIOS all the time, right? But performance-wise, this board's quite good. It's just like all the other boards I tested with the 7700X. Interestingly, I found that out of the box, on stock settings, this board runs the CPU about 30 megahertz faster for a multi-core render. It's not completely just magic though, because despite identical testing conditions and cooling, it is actually giving the CPU 4 to 5 watts more power on average here, so that's kind of to be expected with higher clocks. VRM temps are quite good, especially considering this is basically fanless versus the Asus that has that VRM fan. And none of these VRM temps will pose any problems though. With PBO and a curve optimizer offset of -25, the CPU boosts up quite well with the ASRock board. It's just a little bit more aggressive. So definitely stability test a little bit more thoroughly, but it's running about 50 megahertz higher than the Asus B650E ITX. It is running the CPU with just only 1 watt more though. So multi-core performance is quite good. For gaming, AOE 4, 1440p stock settings, the motherboard actually gave really inconsistent single core clocks, and it's kind of odd. With the Asus board, it's really quite consistent at 5.5 gigahertz. The ASRock board gave clock speeds that wavered between 5.34 gigahertz and 5.49 gigahertz. And it wasn't until tuning PBO, setting the curve optimizer and setting the max plus 200 megahertz clock allowance, that the single core gain clock stabilized at 5.49 gigahertz. So if you're getting this board, definitely take the time to fine tune the PBO settings. I mean, you should do that anyway, but definitely with this board. But when you do that, performance is quite good. So let's sum this one up versus the Asus. Strengths of this board: solid VRM design, power delivery, and the performance once tuned, it's quite good versus the Asus. The layout and the board design is kind of a mixed bag. The Asus board definitely has better placement. This one has, your 3-fan headers, but and 2 of them are 2-amp ones. But then your M.2 fan, it's in a clunky heatsink. The fan occupies one of the headers with a weird cable arrangement. So I think it seems like an afterthought there. Cons: no debug light, but the biggie is definitely the I/O. The ASRock has plenty of USB-A ports, but most of those are USB 2, at least on the rear, and it has fewer high-speed rear USB ports without BIOS flashback functionality on those USB 2.0 ports. As of right now in the US, the ASRock is about $35 cheaper, so I think it's going to come down to what level of I/O you need, especially in the rear. If the Asus I/O options are what you need that many high-speed ports, and I think the extra, it's absolutely going to be worth it, right? If you run out of ports, you're going to be wishing that you spent $35 more to get that right then. You can't fix that after the fact. Of course, keeping in mind, I think both boards are still massively expensive as is, and that's just the state of the boards for Ryzen 7000 right now. If you can live without the I/O though, I think mainly if you're plugging in peripherals, keyboard, mouse, that kind of stuff, where USB 2.0 is sufficient and you can live with some of the clunkiness of the board, or maybe you don't need the fan here and you're just gonna junk it, I think you'll be satisfied with it. And even though it's far from perfect, it's completely adequate and it's really not bad. So I hope you found that helpful. I will be doing a wrap-up shortly where I'll discuss all the pros and cons of the Ryzen 7000 ITX boards, and we'll make some recommendations for all of you, so look for that soon. Please subscribe if you enjoy content like this. Please give a like. Product links are down below. Thanks for watching.